Hello, everybody. Welcome to Principles of Arts, AV, Tech, and Communications. Today, we're starting photography. Welcome to week 4, day 1. Let's get started. All right, so here we are, and we've looked at typography last week. We've looked at some of the elements of design, and now we're going to be moving into something that starts to actually apply some of these ideas. So we're going to be going back and talking about some of those ideas that we've looked at before, and you'll hear them mentioned over and over, and that's how we're going to reinforce those different ideas and those different vocabulary terms. But before we get started on today, I want to make sure that you know that each and every day you're supposed to go to our instructional website. It is right here. It says this week. Every week you need to go there, and each day of the week you need to go there and check out what you're supposed to be doing for that day. And the way it works is you look for the day. This is last week because the website has not been updated. But you look for the day and the date. There's the title of what we're doing that day. And if you scroll down, what you'll see is some objectives, a video that you should watch, and then your assignment. Make sure you do actually watch the video, because what I'm seeing right now in my analytics is that about 40 people out of over 200 are watching the videos, which means that people are not really watching these all the way through, and that is going to cause you some issues later because there's lots of information that applies to what we're learning. After you watch the video, you have your assignment. Please read all of the instructions here. Each one of these assignments has detailed instructions. And when you're ready to work on your assignment, when you're ready to get started working on it, find your class period. All of my online learners, you're the very first button right here. And then we've got first period. I have no second or third period. Fourth period, fifth period, sixth period, seventh period, eighth period. Once you click on those buttons, once you click, it's going to take you over to Google Classroom and to your assignment there. From there, guys, make sure that you turn it in through Google Classroom. In the top right-hand corner, there's a turn in, so make sure you turn it in there. Do not share your assignments with me. If you share them, I do not get them and I do not see them. So they kind of go to a weird place that I can't go to and enter grades for. So Google Classroom is where our grades are getting entered. So submit it through Google Classroom. So one more time, each day you're going to check out our instructional website here. The web address is bit.ly/34JGJ3 and then a capital W. You'll scroll down, see what we're doing for the day, watch your video, do your assignment, turn it in on Google Classroom, and that's it. If you're out, your assignment's always going to be there. If you're an online learner, it's usually loaded by 7 a.m. The day that you're supposed to start working, so make sure you're checking this first. Super important stuff. So today we're going to be talking about photography, and photography has actually changed a lot in the last 20 years, more so than it has in its entire history. It's been around since the mid-1800s, and we've seen a lot of things change. Photography actually started off as using chemicals and different elements to create images. It originally was using silver halide to create images on glass or metal, and now they switched to using silver halide on a film substance, and now we don't even use film anymore. Everything has switched to digital. But there are two different approaches to photography. One of those approaches that you are not as familiar with is the professional approach. The professional approach is that you are creating images. It's a more artistic kind of way of thinking about things. You have an idea of what you want your image to look like. You use tools like cameras, lenses, lighting, locations, backdrops, stands, tripods, assistants. You use all these different tools to craft your image. The flip side of that is more instant or automatic or fun photos. Some of the very first instant photos that we ever saw were the Polaroids. Originally, they were pull-apart film, and then we had what we call integral film, where it just kind of shoots the photo out of the camera. Now, most of you are pretty familiar with Instax, and Fuji still makes quite a bit of instant film, as well as Polaroid is a new company that has taken the Polaroid name, is back, and they do instant film also. Instant film is mostly for fun. And it came around when a time when people wanted to be able to take more photos but didn't want to always hire a photographer. So the quality of an instant photo is not as good as what a photographer would have been able to do on film back in the 1960s and 70s. Where we are now is another place that's very, very similar, because photographers still use big cameras, big lenses, all that fancy equipment. But people still want to be able to take photos for fun, and that's where camera phones come into play. Right now, everyone has a camera on their phone, and they can take fun pictures. Do they look good? Do they have a certain look? Are they very artistic? Most of the time, no. Most of the time, you're just taking a picture to take a picture so that you can post it or do whatever you want with it. So mostly what we do is we don't think about it, we just snap the photo. And what we're going to be learning about in this week is to think about how your camera, even in your phone, actually works. Because here's the crazy thing. Regardless of if it's a camera phone or a $6,000 camera or even a movie camera, a camera you can shoot movies and stuff with, they all work the same because photography concepts are the same whether it's digital or film. Basically, photography is the art of taking light and turning it into a print or an image that can be viewed. So we're going to learn about how light becomes an image, and that's where photography starts. So getting that down is super, super crucial. So today we're going to have, it's going to be one of those days where we start with just some vocabulary words so that we kind of help you guys understand what we're talking about. So we're going to look at, I don't know why did I pick up my pen? I have no idea. I'm going to drop it again because I don't need it. The first thing we're going to talk about, and the thing that you have to know, because if you get this wrong, your photograph is awful. Either you can't see it because it's too dark, or you can't see it because it's completely exploded. But the first thing we're going to talk about is exposure. So exposure is super duper important for us because it's the word we use, but it's the term that we use to talk about if the image is all there. And so what I'm talking about are the shadows. Some of the dark areas of the image are visible. Also, the light areas of the image are visible. So we have shadows, we have mids, and we have highlights is what we generally call them. And we want to expose our image correctly so that we can kind of get all of those things. If you've ever taken a picture outside, maybe you're taking a selfie and behind you the sky is a beautiful blue color, but when you look at the image, it's just white or not really there at all. That's because the sky is what we call overexposed. Or if you've ever thought somebody looked amazing in the light and you take a picture and it doesn't look the same and it's darker, that's because it underexposed. And so exposure is a process. Getting the right exposure means that the image looks great. The highlights are where they're supposed to be, the shadows are still visible, and the midtones are easily visible also and where they need to be. Not too dark, not too bright. So exposure is the vocabulary word. There's a fly that's it's buzzing all over this place. It's annoying me. Exposure is the act, the art of the vocabulary term of making sure the image looks correct. So when it comes to defining this, let's say if I gave you a quiz and I asked you to define exposure, what I want you to think about and how I want you to answer is adjusting the camera so that all parts of the image appear on the print. Adjusting the camera so that all parts of the image, which means highlights, shadows, and midtones, appear on the print. So that's exposure. One more time. Here it is. Boom. Well, I clicked it and nothing happened. So now, boom, exposure. There it goes. Okay. So exposure. There are three components that make up exposure. And we're going to spend some time talking about each one today. Hopefully that's something I can help you guys really wrap your minds around and understand. The first part of exposure, there are 3 parts on the camera that affect exposure. The first part that affects the exposure is the aperture. The aperture is a part of the camera or lens that affects how the exposure looks. I have pulled up image here of different aperture rings, and these exist inside of the camera. And if you look, some of these are quite small, and some of these are quite large. And this is representative of the same lens that has, every one of them has an adjustable aperture. If you have ever noticed your own eyes when you walk outside, other people's eyes will get really, really, really small. Their pupils get like a little bitty. And that's because the aperture of the eye is closing down to let in less light. However, if you're inside in a dark room and you look at someone's pupils, they're generally like very, very wide. And that's because the aperture of the eye has widened to let in more light. So there is a mechanical aperture on every lens that allows you to let in more or less light, and it's adjustable. And the crazy thing about these things is that apertures, and we're going to get into this a little bit more, we'll talk about it more tomorrow, apertures are measured in f-stops, and so we're going to talk about that more tomorrow. Here's what's confusing. This always confuses me anyways. The biggest aperture, as you can see right here, that is the lowest number. So this may be f1.4. That's crazy. And then the smallest aperture, this little bitty spot, well, that may be f22, which is the smallest hole but the largest number. And then it's the exact opposite over here, the largest hole and the smallest numbers. So apertures are measured in f-stops. They range from f1, they can go higher than that, all the way up to f22, and they can go more than f22. You can have f32, you can have f64, you can have all sorts of crazy very, 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 very small apertures. So aperture is a ring, an adjustable ring that allows more or less light into the camera. So that's aperture. The next thing we're going to talk about is shutter speed. Shutter speed. So shutter speed is another important thing that allows light into the camera. But basically the shutter is a curtain. And it opens and closes. If you've got blinds at your house, imagine like opening and closing the blinds really fast. That's kind of how a shutter works in most cameras. Some modern cameras have an electronic shutter. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that, but many photography cameras still have a real shutter. Now, if you're using your phone, electronic shutter, not quite the same, but it still serves the same purpose. So a shutter is a curtain that exposes and it basically opens up and lets light in. Here's the crazy thing about shutter. If it's a really slow shutter and somebody's moving like this, the shutter will actually allow enough light in for this to be blurred. So it's like, it's blurry. And if you increase the shutter speed like even faster, you can actually freeze someone's hand. I can remember like laying on the floor playing around with my first camera, and I took a picture, and the fan in the room, the ceiling fan, was just like blurry. And so I turned the shutter speed up and kept taking pictures until I made the fan blade stand perfectly still. And so shutter speed, the faster it is, the less light it lets in, but it also freezes motion better. So shutter affects how much light gets into the camera, but it also affects how much motion blur is associated with it. So that is something very, very important to think of, especially if you're going to be like a sports photographer. If you've ever tried taking photos at a sporting event and the images come out a little blurry, that's because your shutter speed is way too slow. Of course, the downside is if you turn the shutter speed up really high, your images get darker and darker. So it's kind of a trade-off. The last and third thing that affects exposure in a camera is ISO. No, it's actually ISO is how most people pronounce it. ISO. It used to be called ASA, and things kind of changed because ASA stood for American Standards. They don't want to do American standards. We're a big country, but there's a bigger world out there, so they changed it to international standards. So now we have the ISO is how the sensitivity of your media is measured. And so that can be really confusing because you can have film that is rated at an ISO, or you can have a digital camera that's rated at ISO whatever. Here's the thing that's crazy. On film, if I go buy a box of film, it will tell me on the box that it's 800 is the ISO. And that tells me that it has a certain sensitivity to light. So the higher the number of that film, like 800, the more I can shoot with it in darker areas, like inside of a house. The lower the number, like 100, that means it's less sensitive to light. So 100 is great when you're outside in the sunlight. But 800 is definitely better for when you're inside trying to shoot something. So ISO is the same on a digital camera, but unlike a film camera, on a digital camera, you can adjust the ISO. And the ISO can range anywhere from 50, which is for super, super, super bright daylight, all the way up to, on some modern cameras, 100,000 or more. So you can practically see in the dark with your camera. Some newer cameras are amazing what their ISO levels can go to. So ISO is the measurement of the sensitivity of the media. So it could be film or it could be a digital sensor. So yeah, it's the sensitivity of the media, and that's what you kind of need to remember. So that is ISO, and it's very easy to spell, I-S-O, ISO. So here's the thing. We have 3 elements that affect exposure. The crazy thing about these 3 elements is that every camera has them. And in every camera, whether you know it or not, whether it's your iPhone, whether it's your Chromebook camera, whether it is your very expensive Nikon DSLR, they all have an aperture, they all have a shutter and a shutter speed, and they all have an ISO sensitivity setting. And those 3 things actually all work together to make the exposure correct. So most of the time when you pick up your iPhone and you go to take a picture, it does everything automatically. And what it is adjusting automatically for you is the aperture, the shutter, and the ISO. It's adjusting all those things automatically for you. If you've ever taken pictures with a real camera and it's just been on the automatic mode, it's actually making decisions for you every time you take a picture. Professionals generally never do automatic. And the reason why is because we know what we want the light to look like. And so we manually set our image settings, our exposure settings. We manually adjust them. We adjust ISO, we adjust the aperture, we adjust the shutter because we know what we're looking for. So what we're going to be learning about this week is adjusting those manual settings and how they have an effect on the image, because every adjustment you make has an effect on the image. We talked a little bit about shutter speed and how it affects motion blur, but aperture has an effect and ISO has an effect also, besides making the image brighter or dimmer. So tomorrow we're going to really take some time and explore those aspects in a lot more detail. But today you have an assignment to do. The assignment is actually listed underneath this video, so please check it out. Read it in a lot of detail. Don't be surprised if there is a quiz at the end of the week that includes definitions for exposure, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So definitely want to check that out. This week we're going to be having a lot of fun with your camera phone. And whatever you can get that will take pictures. We're going to just have some fun with it and explore photography. There's a fly that just keeps on buzzing around. It's been annoying me all day, y'all. But we're going to take some pictures and have some fun with that this week because we're getting ready to move into Photoshop. And we can't really do Photoshop unless we're taking some pictures too. So we're going to learn both things as we get going. I hope you guys are having a great day. Don't forget, follow me on Remind at PRINOFAV1. Also, find me on Twitter at stupid fly. Find me on Twitter at Mr. Brown THS, and you can follow me and check out some of the stuff we're doing. Have a great day, guys. See y'all later.